Good morning and welcome to today's virtual program, Putting Your Tax Dollars to Work, Federal Grant Data. I am your presenter, Hadiza Saadu. I'm also the Small Business and Nonprofit Specialist here at the Kansas City Public Library. So let's dive into our learning objectives for our time today. Okay, our first objective is to primarily understand the purpose and background of USAspending.gov. There is a bit of legislative history that goes with the creation of USAspending.gov that is relevant as far as just understanding how the data is presented and why it's available. Next, what we're going to do is do a live demo to explore the federal spending data based off of budget function, uh, agency, as well as object class. Third, we are going to access and examine agency profiles to understand how each listed agency spends its funding. And then last but not least, we're going to identify a few ongoing learning resources. So just to let you know, all of this information is available on USAspending.gov. And what we're doing is really just taking an exploratory look at what you can find through USAspending.gov. And really, this is just meant to be an introduction for anybody that has ever been curious about how our federal government allocates the budget and how our different agencies spend their funding. All right, so a little bit of background. USAspending.gov is the official source for spending data for the US government, and it allows individuals and institutions to trace spending from congressional appropriations to federal agencies to local communities to businesses. So in 2006 came the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act. And what this did was it required federal contract grants, loan, and other financial assistance awards of more than $25,000 to be displayed on a publicly accessible and searchable website to give the American public access information on how their tax dollars are getting spent. I think that's a pretty good deal. We do pay taxes. It would be good to know how our taxes get spent collectively. 2 years later came the Government Funding Transparency Act of 2008. This was an amendment to the FFATA, and it required prime recipients to report details on first tier sub-recipients of awards as of October 1st, 2010. So what this is saying is that the federal government is going to allocate a pot of money to a agency, prime recipient, an organization, and then that organization sometimes then allocates that funding further, and then those recipients are called sub-recipients. Last but not least came the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act of 2014. And what this did was it expanded the transparency efforts of the FFATA. A little bit more on the Data Act itself. Okay, the Data Act added a little bit, or maybe a lot. So what it did is it expands on the FFATA by disclosing direct agency expenditures and linking federal contract, loan, and grant spending information to federal agency programs. So what this is just saying is the Data Act allowed it so that federal spending through the form of a contract, through the form of a loan, or a grant, uh, that information is directly linked to the corresponding federal agency programs because federal spending is all allocated. What this also did was it established the government-wide, excuse me, it establishes the government-wide data standards for financial data and sets the basic understanding that the government is going to provide consistent, reliable, and searchable data that is displayed accurately. So basically, you don't need to have a data background to be able to understand what is being displayed on the website. Further, the Data Act simplifies reporting, it streamlines reporting requirements, and reduces the compliance cost while improving transparency for those that need to report. And all in all, the Data Act works to improve the quality of the data that's submitted to USAspending.gov by holding agencies accountable to these standards. Again, all of this is to the public benefit because the public pays taxes. All right, so we are going to start to explore this database now. What we're looking at here is part of the Explorer that is on USAspending.gov. We will get to that in just a second. What we're looking at here is just the header page for the Explorer using the budget function search, basically, or the breakdown. So when you are using the Explorer, what you're able to do is basically access information about federal spending in different ways. So you can do it by budget function, you can do it by agency, and you can also do it by object class, which just means uh, uh, the type of service or product that is provided or asked for by the federal government. Okay, so what we see here is that we are viewing the fiscal year 2024 spending by budget function. This is coming from the $7 trillion federal spending budget as of June 29th, 2024. Let's go ahead and look at this on the actual web page. Okay, we are now in the Government Spending Explorer. And when you are on the USAspending.gov homepage, just make sure you have taken note of the menu tab here. What we're going to be at is the second tab, Explore the Data. In the left-hand side, Spending Explorer, Budget Function. Okay, you can see here, it says we can drill down from high-level categories addressing national needs. All right, so the federal government categorizes different needs with different names. So let's look at what our federal government categorizes these needs as with names. Okay, so in our federal budget of $7 trillion, there are 3, 4, 5 very prominent needs that are taking up the budget, which are Medicare, Social Security, National Defense, net interest, health, income security, general government, veterans benefits and services, education, training, employment, and social services, commerce and housing credit, and then several other categories that are take up too little of the budget to be displayed in their boxes because we're talking about proportional figures here within this chart. But we can hover over each one and get not only the percentage, but the actual spending amount that is allocated. So let's take a look at health, which is allocated at 11.4% of the total budget at $804.4 billion. Let's look at how this drills down. So within the budget sub-function, in the broader function of health, the majority of the function is going to healthcare services. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it means that healthcare services totaling $761 billion or 94.6% of the health function of the budget. So the vast majority of that part of the budget. So within healthcare services, those services are going to different federal spending accounts based off of activities. So majority of this spending is focused on grants that are going to states for Medicaid, for Centers for Medicare and Medicaid services, and Health and Human Services, which I know it doesn't show that entire phrase, but that is what that is saying. So we see that the federal government does give grants to states who then allocate that money into institutions that provide Medicare services, that are institutions of Medicaid, and institutions of health and human services. So we see then the drill down between what the federal government has named as a need for the public, to then seeing that that need is a need in all of the states. So more broadly speaking, the federal government knows that it has the activity of giving grants to states who then know best, according to the federal government, how to allocate that money for that specific need based off of the institutions that exist. So that's just one breakdown. We can do that same kind of breakdown for each of the other categories here. I do want to make sure that we continue to move forward. So we've gone through budget function and then gotten to sub-function, and now we're looking at the federal accounts related to the sub-function. Let's look further, and now we get the actual program activity that is being supported, and we see that this is Medicaid vendor payments. So those services, the grants to states for Medicaid centers for Medicare, et cetera, are vast majority Medicaid vendor payments. Let's see further. What else? Okay. And so those are in the form of grants and fixed charges. This is giving us an idea of how money flows from the federal government to the state, to more local institutions that address a specific need that as identified by the federal government. And so now what we're looking at here is object class. So we see a little bit that the Explorer does overlap a little bit. So we've just gone through budget function. Let's go to agency. And now we are seeing the $7 trillion budget, which shows fiscal year 2024. And I forgot to mention that we are in Q3. So what it's going to display by default is where we are at in the year. So we're at the end of Q3, going into the month of September, month 9. You can also adjust this filter if you'd like to. If you want to just focus on 1 month, you can do that. If you want to focus on 1 month or the entire year, you are absolutely free to do that. We are looking at the entire year of 2024. All right, so what we're looking at here is drill down by agency. We see that we've got the Department of Health and Human Services as the agency that takes up the most of the federal budget at $1.9 trillion. Then we've got the Department of Treasury, which takes up $1.5 trillion of the budget. And then Social Security Administration, still in the trillions here. And then we've got Department of Defense coming in close to $1 trillion. And then we've got the rest of the departments that are listed here that you can also explore. Got the Department of Homeland Security, unreported data, Department of Agriculture, Department of Veterans Affairs, Office of Personnel Management, Department of Education at 2% comparatively. We've got the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, Department of Housing and Urban Development at 1% of our budget. Let's drill down. We can take a look at the portion of the budget that is the largest, the Department of Health and Human Services. And now we see, much like budget function into subfunction, then into federal account. Once we have clicked on, once we started to drill down by agency, we go directly into the breakdown by federal account. So now we're getting a feel for how the money is flowing again, but this time by agency. So federal government allocates part of the budget to each agency and then issues the majority of that spending in the form of grants to states for Medicaid, centers for Medicare. Then next comes federal supplementary medical insurance. Then we've got payments to healthcare trust funds. Then we've got federal hospital insurance trust funds. Then we've got Medicare prescription drug accounts, centers for Medicare and Medicaid services, health and human services, etc. We can keep going. But as you can see, we're seeing the information a little bit differently. Let's look at the grants. Okay, those again, going to Medicaid vendor payments. All of those are in the form of grants and fixed charges as a form of dispersing that payment, dispersing that money. Okay. All right, now we're down to object class and it's taking its time here. So I think that's a sign for us to then go ahead back to the Explorer and just go ahead and search by object class. Let's see how this looks when we start searching that way. Okay, so back to the $7 trillion budget, fiscal year 2024. This time we are looking at things by object class. All right, so this is where we get into how can you actually trace the money from the federal government in the form of grants? Maybe we should have started with object class. But now that we're here and we've already seen object class twice, now we know that object class really is just the form of the product or service that the federal government is budgeting for. Okay, so we see here that the vast majority are in grants and fixed charges. Let's go ahead and look further. What does that actually spiral out into? We've taken a look extensively at Department of Health and Human Services, but what other agencies are primarily operating in grants and fixed charges? So we've got the Department of Health and Human Services, we've got the Social Security Administration, and we've got the Department of Treasury, as well as the Department of Veterans Affairs, Office of Personnel Management, Department of Housing and Urban Development, Department of Agriculture, Department of Education, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, Department of Labor, Department of Homeland Security, Small Business Administration, Department of the State, Federal Communications Commission. Okay, so we're seeing now that what the different agencies, how much of the amount of the federal budget, which is allocated or dispersed in grants and fixed charges, or is allowed to be allocated that way? How much goes to each agency? And we see again, Department of Health and Human Services is getting the most. Who's getting the least? Let's look. This tiny, tiny little table. Okay. National Aeronautics and Space Administration, that's 0. Department of Justice, 0.1%. Let's look. Okay. Interesting, interesting. Let's look at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is getting 1.3% of the allocated federal budget that is going to be dispersed through grants and fixed charges. Okay, so we've got several different categories here, which majority of it is tenant-based rental assistance, public and Indian or native housing, and urban development. We've got that at 42.6% of the grants and fixed charges. Homeless assistance, and we know that homelessness is a persisting problem across the US, especially here in Kansas City. We see that the federal government has allocated out of the grants and fixed charges way of dispersing money, 4.8% or 3.1 billion to homeless assistance grants, community planning and development, housing and urban development. Okay. So we see then how the database kind of weaves in and out of itself. So we've gone from object class now to the agency, now to the federal account. And if we want to drill down further, let's look at tenant-based rental assistance. Okay, and we see specifically that the largest portion of this is in the form of contract renewals. Then we've got administrative fees, tenant-based rental assistance in emergency situations, emergency vouchers, Section 811 mainstream vouchers, tenant protection, administrative fees. So this is just very interesting to see that all of these are named in the budget as far as the program activity that is taking place that the federal government has said this is something we want to allocate some funding to. Let's look further at contract renewals and see more about what that program activity is specifically if we can. I'm not sure if we can drill down further. And we might not be able to. Right, it may not be able to let us. Let's see. Okay, let's go. Okay, so this is where we're getting into more specific things, which is a little bit beyond the scope of what we were intending today, but you can get into the specific recipients and the total award amounts if you want to. Let's go ahead and see what displays. I will admit I have not personally gone that far. It looks like it is taking its sweet time. It may not have that information available yet because this is the fiscal year 2024. If we wanted to, we can go back in time and look at previous years. And that may be a good or an interesting exploratory project for anyone that might be watching to compare spending in specific program areas, program activities, or object classes by year, just to see how things have changed. As we can see here, we've got information that goes back to fiscal year 2017. All right. And if you want to clear it off, you can go ahead and just start over. And if you are on the Explorer page, you will see it look like this. You can select by budget function, agency, or object class. And always make use of the resources available to you. If you are stuck, learn more is your friend. I'm gonna go back to the PowerPoint. We are getting to the end of presentation. Before we get to the final end, we're gonna look at another thing, and it is called agency profile. So I'm just gonna pull up that slide. So this is just a snapshot of the Department of Health and Human Services. Uh, if we don't really necessarily want to do drill downs like that, we just kind of want to get a quick snapshot by agency. The federal government has kindly put together spending profiles for the different federal agencies. So let's go ahead and take a look. We are on the agency profile section of USAspending.gov. Here we can dive into federal agency spending, and then we can find details on agencies' total obligations as well as outlays to understand how each agency is spending its allocated funding. Then we've got a little bit of legal background here for those who are interested in that. When we just scan this, we've got all 108 agencies listed, starting with agency name, then the congressional justification of the budget. So we can see the Congress's articulation of why that agency is required, and then the amount of the monetary amounts of spending allocated, as well as the percentage of the federal budget that the agency takes up. So we've got the Department of Treasury, Department of Health and Human Services, which we just looked at a screenshot of, and we're going to take a deeper look. And the Department of Defense come in the top three. So let's go ahead and look at Department of Health and Human Services. We've got the link to the congressional justification, if we want to take a look at that. And then we've got the total amount, which is over 3 trillion, 21.888%. Here, let's go ahead and look at this profile. Department of Health and Human Services. What we've got the mission statement, its website, and then a summary. So this is very easy to read. Don't need to have a data background. We love this. All right. How much funding is available to this agency? We've got 3.02 trillion in budgetary resources, and we see the change over time. So we don't necessarily even have to go into the Data Explorer to manually select the fiscal year filters unless we're trying to look prior to fiscal year 20. But we're looking at the past 5 years here from 2020 to present and how that has changed. How much has this agency planned to spend? Okay, so it has planned as of projected to September, it's planning to spend 1.86 trillion of its total obligations, and that would be 61.8% of its resources. So it's got money left on the table. we see that the change in the total amount allocated has grown, as we had already mentioned. But let's just look at the actual numbers here. In fiscal year 20, the number was almost 2.5 trillion, and now it's at 3 trillion. So it's been steadily going up, finally breaking 3 trillion this year. Okay, so knowing that, we also know that this year they have not spent the full budget, and they plan as of today to spend 1.86 trillion of those obligations. So that's not really telling us what they intend to do through the end of the year. But the question, how much has the agency planned to spend on awards? 1.53 trillion in award obligations. So this breaks down into majority financial assistance and then a minority in contracts. Okay. So now we can take a look at the sub components for the Department of Health and Human Services. And we see we've got the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. You can see, let's read this graph here. So let's take a look at the bottom of the graph. We've got fiscal year 2024 obligations and then fiscal year 2024 total budgetary resources. So fiscal year 2024 obligations in dark greenish blue. And then we've got light green as the fiscal year 2024 total budgetary resources. So we are just taking a look here at what each category is allocated at out of the total budget. And so the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid take up 2.77 trillion as far as the resources that it has available within the the federal budget. And its obligations for fiscal year 2024 are to allocate 1.73 trillion of that. Then we see that comparatively with the Administration for Children and Families compared to National Institutes of Health, Indian Health Service, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Health Resources and Services Administration, and the list goes on. So we can see how each subcomponent takes up the budget of Health and Human Services, or how much the Department of Health and Human Services has as far as its ability to disperse. Okay. So we got another summary here. How much is the Department of Health and Human Services spending on contracts and financial assistance? So now we've got a breakdown by object class here. So let's go ahead and take a look at loans since we're focused on, or excuse me, grants since we are focused on grants. So in grants, the Department of Health and Human Services had total award obligations in this year of 2024 fiscal year, 749.48 billion in the form of a grant. And that totals into 397 transactions that are grants. And there are 15,403 new awards in the form of grants. So money that is not needing to be paid back. And we've got the list of all the sub-agencies and their total transactions and the number of new awards as a very granular breakdown here. So we really can get quite a lot of information without having to even really take a detailed search in the more extensive database, which we're not covering today. So quite a lot of information about how the federal government allocates spending and how part of that spending goes into the form of grants that go to states, that go to institutions that provide services and products that meet the different needs that the federal government has created agencies for. Uh, let's get back to the PowerPoints, and we're going to talk a little bit about different learning resources. Make sure that we are sharing the right screen. Awesome. All right. So this is our last slide here, and this is just a list of a few learning resources. Again, all of these are on USAspending.gov, so don't rely on this PowerPoint. There's a lot more in USAspending.gov that I was even able to cover today. And by that, I really just mean I've only scratched the surface. So just know there's a lot more information out there. There's a lot more resources to help deepen your skill set with it and your approach to finding information. So we've got first a link to the Federal Spending Guide, which is really just a guide on how to really understand the ways that the federal government allocates budget. Then we've got training videos for those who are more visual learners, straight from the US government. So you know that the guide within the training for visual learning is 100% not a middleman or anything like that. They want you to be able to access this information. So if it makes sense, use it. Data dictionary is very, very useful for those who may not understand what some of the jargon is, and that's probably everybody, honestly. If you don't have a data background, some of this information is going to go, it's not really going to click until you really explore and spend a lot of time with it. One example I can think of is the term object class. That is not necessarily a term that most people are going to associate with the federal government's basically seeking either services or products in the form of some kind of relationship with an agency. Uh, and finally, I've got a link to the data sources. So for those that are maybe you're doing a presentation or you have some point to make, being able to cite your sources is very important. So understanding where the federal government is getting its information so that you understand how that information is displayed can be super important if that question comes up in a setting. So make sure you take advantage of that research and of these resources that are available. It's all there for you. And I'm just presenting a small little window. So with that, that is the conclusion of our virtual programs today, putting your tax dollars to work, federal grant data. Thank you so much for tuning in.